Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Enia Krivine, Senior Director of the FDD's Israel program. Enia, thank you so much for joining me.
Brittany, thank you for having me.
It is a solemn day today. It's the anniversary of October 7th. It has been a year since Hamas launched an attack on Israel from air, land, and sea in the deadliest assault in the country's history. Since then, tens of thousands have been killed as conflicts between Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran have spilled across the Middle East. A year later, what are you thinking right now?
Thank you. So indeed, in Israel, it's a somber day. There are somber days on the Jewish calendar, both in the secular calendar and in Israel. And this has now been added to the list of somber days in Israel. The beaches were empty, very few people were out, and there were many, many commemoration ceremonies throughout the country. And one thing out is that a lot of those ceremonies were disrupted by rocket fire, and not just from Gaza. Rocket fire came into Israel today alone from the Houthis, from the east, as Israel, which is usually Iraq or Syria, and from Hezbollah. So when Israel talks about a multi-theater war, at least 7 hot fronts that Israel is dealing with. And of course, last week, as Israel was bracing for the Iranian missile attack, there was a terror attack in a suburb of Tel Aviv, in Jaffa. 7 Israelis were killed. That was from a terrorist from the West Bank. And then just yesterday, a terror attack from an Israeli Arab in Israel's southern city of Beersheba. It does feel like there is a lot going on. Some Israelis describe it as the October 7th that just keeps happening, that they haven't been able to get out of this sort of high threat scenario since October 7th. So a whole year of intense war. And we've certainly seen an escalation in the past couple of weeks, which has been very, very pronounced throughout the country.
I mean, that really sounds like a nightmare. As an American, I can't imagine every day for a year feeling like it's 9/11 all over again, and you're living that nightmare again and again and again. And like you mentioned, there is that escalation. How are the people in Israel feeling about that, and what do they want to be seen done?
Well, I don't want to talk for all Israelis. Obviously, Israel is not a monolith. It's a very diverse country with lots of different political opinions and ethnicity. But I will say that there is a general feeling that in the past 3 weeks, the war has taken a turn, and that Israel may have finally put in place a strategy that might change some of the chessboard. You know, going into October 7th, Israel was surrounded by over a dozen proxies that are armed, trained, and equipped by Iran. And Israel had the walls closing in on them with all of these proxies, just bolder and better armed, better trained. Iran becoming more belligerent and in its race towards a nuclear weapon. And there was this feeling that the walls were closing in. So October 7th happened. It woke Israelis up. They understood that their policy, their strategy for the last 20 years of allowing these proxies to become more and more dangerous without taking decisive action against them, incredible. It's not a way that Israelis can live after the atrocities of October 7th. And for the 11 months of this war, it didn't seem like Netanyahu, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, he had a strategy out of this. It didn't seem like there was a way to put Israelis on the back foot. But then 3 weeks ago, changed the war goals to add the Northern Front. It was the first time in 11 months that they had actually included the Northern Front as part of their war goals. Israel went on the offensive, and there was the beeper attack and the walkie-talkie attack, and the Hezbollah bunker that decapitated of the terrorization. And now, of course, Israel's facing off against Iran, or as many would say, head of the snake, in what might be a decisive turn of events for the Jewish state.
So a year ago, hostages were taken into Gaza. Now hostages remain in Gaza. Some have been released in a ceasefire agreement, a temporary agreement in November of last year. But How close do you think Israel is to negotiating to getting those hostages back? And A, is that Israel's goal still? And B, how has that goal changed a year out when, as you're saying, Israel is facing a multi-front conflict?
So when Israel turned its attention to the 3 weeks ago, there was an outcry from hostage families. You're right, 101 hostages remain in Gaza. Not that many of them, sadly, are at most, it's probably in the high 30s. But still, there are live hostages in Gaza, and it has been since the beginning of the war Israel's priority to get them back, their number one war. But as it turned its attention to the north, many feared that these hostages have been forgotten. But Netanyahu, what he has now verbalized to the hostages, the families of hostages that he's been in dialogue with, is this phase of the war just a few weeks. Essentially, what Israel's trying to do is it's trying to gain leverage. It's trying to go after Hamas's patrons and Hezbollah, the most powerful Iranian regional proxy, to show that there is no way out of it. And Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, who is elusive to Israelis, he's the one Hamas leader in Gaza that remains alive. And he's still the leader of our organization. His dream from the beginning has been that these regional proxies, Hezbollah especially, but also Iran itself, would come to the Hamas's rescue, would come and join in, and finally band together to destroy Israel. And so by taking the initiative, by going on the offensive, by decapitating and degrading Hezbollah, by telling Iran that they are on watch and Israel will not stand by while Iran threatens Israel, attacks Israel with ballistic. Israel is now trying to get the upper hand. And according to Benjamin Netanyahu, the goal is once Israel has said that there's no help coming from Hamas, this is the end of this chapter, then going back and trying to negotiate for those hostages.
I've had the pleasure of speaking with a few analysts and experts from the FDD like yourself. One last week, Brad Bowman said that Hezbollah rather, is the varsity threat there. And they, like you said, are essentially decapitated now. You're saying Israel's saying to Iran now, you're on watch. What does that mean, and what will that look like in the coming days and weeks of this conflict?
So Hezbollah is absolutely the varsity team. Brad is always right. Hezbollah has been a terror feared in Israel for over a decade. They were known to have 150 to 200,000 rockets. It was Hezbollah to the tune of $1 billion a year, right? This is crown jewel in its proxy strategy. But in the past couple of weeks, we've seen Israel decisively degrade Hezbollah. The threat is not over, and Israel's now fighting a campaign against the terror organization, and there will be losses. We know that this is a battle-hardened proxy, and there is no room for hubris. They also have, even though Israel has been very effective at degrading their weapons capability, they also still have tens of thousands. So you asked what the strategy with Iran. Well, as you know, on October 1st, Iran attacked Israel with 180 ballistic missiles. And, these are not the rockets that Hamas has been using, as big as a bus, and it is laden with explosives. And when these things hit, they hurt in their wake. And 180 of these flying over information centers on October 1st is what every Israeli was watching on their screens or from their windows and hearing their ears. So there's going to be an Israeli response to this. Here's the good news. The good news is that the Biden administration, after the attack, came out with strong words for Iran, and said that it would work with Israel in order to impose serious consequences on the regime in Tehran. Now, that's the answer from the Biden administration, because the last time Iran conducted a direct attack on Israel, back in April, the Biden administration came out afterwards and told Israel to stand down, which was the worst type of response he could have given. And by the way, basically brought us to where we are today with another even larger, even more deadly attack just last week. So the Biden administration this time, it seems they've learned their lessons. They said work with Israel to formulate their response. They understand that Iran has crossed the line, and we are expecting that response from Israel in the coming days.
And is there any sense of what that response is going to look like? Because the attack or the Iranian missile strike last week was massive.
Correct. It was massive, and more than the amount of missiles they sent. Of course, every missile is a potential mass casualty event. These are huge missiles, and they went over population centers. So Israel's not going to respond in kind. Israel does not shoot indiscriminate rocket population centers. However, Israel is likely to do a very targeted attack on Iranian either infrastructure, energy infrastructure, which will degrade its economy, potentially nuclear scientists or either regime leaders, and potentially the nuclear site. These are all targets that understand are on the table from Israel's perspective. The administration in Washington has said that if they've advised Israel against the oil infrastructure, and we understand that those could have ripple effects on the global economy. So I understand where the administration is from on that. They've also warned Israel not to attack their sites, which I find a little bit perplexing. But of course, they're trying to attempt to support Israel, which is good, but also contain Israel at the same time, which is always the give and take. The United States administration and the Israelis, especially, you see this dynamic playing out over and over again of support but restrain, support and restrain. These are the words that characterize the relationship since October 7th, 2023.
And yes, something that I keep thinking about in this conversation is something you said at the beginning, which people in Israel feel like they're reliving October 7th again and again each day. We have really seen this conflict evolve in the past year and really grow. It's essentially a regional war without anyone saying this is a larger regional war. So is there a sense that we are in the middle right now? We're nearing the end. What does that look like?
So it's hard to predict. War has a way of determining its own agenda. But I would say that Israel is nearing the end of this phase of the war. And I say that because when it was going into this war on October 8th, or whenever it took goals very early on, there were three goals. It was to destroy Hamas as a military organization, to return the hostages, and to make sure Gaza would never be a launching pad for similar attacks. It was a huge undertaking because this is an organization that had had its grips on the enclave for 2 decades, unchallenged, no elections, no political factions, no voices of dissent, right? This is a terrorist organization that pervaded every aspect of Gazan life. They were in the healthcare, they were in the humanitarian organization. The journalists also doubled as terrorists, and we've seen this again when there's unfortunately someone dies in Gaza, and the international community condemns Israel for going after whether it's a school or a journalist or a doctor or whatever, and only to find out that these individuals are Hamas or other terrorist organizations. They actually claim the individual. Going in there and trying to reverse 20 years of rot was a daunting challenge, and Israel is still trying to do that, and it's going to take, and rebuilding is going to be a critical phase. But the military goals have been largely achieved. Now Israel, the last military goal that remains, or the last goal of the war that remains, is getting the hostages back. And in my opinion, what's going on in the north and Israel's decision to change the tempo of the war, to decisively go after the other Iranian proxies in the region, is essentially an attempt to try and reverse the last 11 months where Israel's kind of been drawn into this pattern of negotiation, fruitless negotiations, hostages, with Hamas constantly moving the goalposts, with the media, doing their best apparently, but also unintentionally causing additional problems and miscommunications in the negotiations. It's just been a fruitless exercise since November. So Israel's now a different approach. It's gone on the offensive, and it's trying a new strategy that, as I said, many Israelis are on board with.
Like we keep saying in this conversation, we are a year out from that tragic, unspeakable, heartbreaking day of October 7th, and seeing what has transpired in the past year. As someone who's currently in Israel right now, do you think anything's missing from the international dialogue surrounding this conflict?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of things are missing, but this is nothing new to Israel. Israel, as it goes into every conflict with its adversaries, that there's always going to be a moment where the tide turns and sympathy turns into rage and anger and distrust and frustration with Israel for trying to defend itself. I think that's like Israelis know on the onset. So unfortunately, I think that there's a lack of understanding of what Israel faces. So many people in the international community, especially young, Gen Zers or whoever came after millennials, I think it was Gen Z, out on college campuses and throwing around word side and war crime without having any understanding of what that actually means, or even able to find Israel on a map, frankly. I think that, unfortunately, the issue of Israel turned into a political football. I wish it wasn't the case, and I do. There was a little bit more pragmatism and a little better understanding of basic history and geography. So those are the things that I think are missing. But I think this is a very human condition where we like to get very worked up about things that we don't understand that well. And unfortunately, we've seen it again and again when it comes to Israel defending itself against a region that is just full of adversaries.
Well, Enia Krivine, I appreciate the conversation today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you can join me again soon.
Brittany, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.